After my dad's funeral, when the ground was still soft above his grave and my hands still smelled like the flowers I laid for him, I walked into my aunt's backyard for my baby cousin's first birthday. I thought I was showing up for family. Instead, she stood there with a smile sharp enough to cut through bone and said, "My son is actually your dad's child. So as his inheritance, I'll be taking half of your $800,000 house." Then she held up a will-fake paper trembling between her fingers like it carried the truth. And I remember the exact moment the world stopped around me. The pitying looks, the whispers, the way she waited for me to fall apart. But instead, I just said, "Oh, I see," and tried not to laugh. Because my dad made sure a lie like hers could never touch him. Or me. My name is Rowan Vale, and this is the moment everything I thought I knew about family shattered. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say, "listening" in the comments, or tell me where you are. I love hearing how far my story reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if you'd like to walk through this story with me to the end, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you know, especially when you're trying to speak the truth into a world that doesn't always want to hear it. I'm Rowan, and this is how my life broke open. My name is Rowan Vale. I'm 30 years old, a landscape architect who has spent more time shaping other people's peace than finding my own. Until last week, I lived with my father in our $800,000 home in Hawthorne District, Portland, a house filled with the quiet warmth he built after my mother died when I was 16. He was all I had left in this world, and losing him felt like losing gravity. The story truly begins at his funeral inside St. John's while Portland's rain pressed against the stained glass like a steady reminder that nothing in this city is ever really dry. It had rained for 3 days straight, long enough to feel like the weather was grieving with me. I stood in front of his casket trying to hold myself together long enough to say a few words. I talked about the man he was, Dr. Cassian Vale, a respected cardiologist, a father who was somehow both steady and soft, the kind of man who treated me less like a son and more like someone he genuinely admired. We were close in a way I didn't realize was rare until much later. He taught me everything from how to prune fruit trees to how to tell when a person's smile doesn't reach their eyes. My mother's side of the family arrived halfway through the service. I saw them before I heard them. My aunt, Selena Rowan, walked in first, my mother's younger sister, dressed in something far too bright, far too fitted, far too Celine for a funeral. Behind her were my grandparents, who trailed after her the way they always did, as if their loyalty was tethered to the daughter who needed the most attention. They had spent their whole lives protecting Celine from her mistakes, from her impulsiveness, from consequences she never quite had to face. Celine barely offered condolences before asking me in a whisper, only I could hear, whether Dad had left behind a will and what arrangements had been made for the house. Her eyes weren't grieving, they were calculating. She looked at the home I shared with my father the way a shopper eyes a display window, as if she were evaluating it for size, color, and resale value. Something in me recoiled. My mother had warned me long ago that Celine's sweetness was always layered over something slippery. My father, more diplomatic, once told me something I didn't fully understand until that day: sometimes the people closest to you can hurt you in ways strangers never will. When the service ended, guests trickled out beneath umbrellas. Celine approached me again, brushing imaginary lint from my coat sleeve, a gesture that felt rehearsed, invasive. "That house of yours," she murmured surely. "Cassian left something in the will for the Rowan side, right? Family should share with family." I sidestepped the question, but unease curled in my stomach. As I prepared to leave, I caught her staring at my father's portrait, an expression not of sorrow but of contemplation, almost hunger flickering over her face. In that moment, without knowing why, I felt a cold premonition settle into my bones. And as I stepped out into the rain-soaked street, I couldn't shake the sense that the funeral was only the beginning. I had no way of knowing that within a week Celine would drop a bomb that would tear open everything I thought I understood about grief, loyalty, and blood. I couldn't imagine how deep her betrayal would cut, or how loudly the world around me would shatter. A week after the funeral, just when I thought I might finally get a full night's sleep, my grandmother began calling non-stop. She insisted I attend Milo's first birthday party, Celine's son, my little cousin. I wasn't ready to stand in a crowd, much less in a backyard filled with people who would tiptoe around the subject of my father. But my grandparents pleaded, reminding me how my father valued family, how he always showed up even when it hurt. They used his name as leverage, and because I was still raw enough for it to work, I agreed. The moment I said yes, a familiar discomfort resurfaced. Memories of Celine at the funeral replayed in my mind, the way she asked about the house, the way she looked at Dad's picture like she was measuring how much of his legacy she could claim. Celine had always carried that edge of envy. My mother once told me Celine hated being compared to her. Hated that my mother had the career, the marriage, the stability she didn't. And after my mother died, Celine's appearances became strangely timed. She popped up during every crisis as if drawn to vulnerability the way some people are drawn to opportunity. I remembered moments with my father that I had brushed aside then but now saw through a different lens. A too long touch from Celine at a holiday dinner. The time she showed up at his clinic unannounced, pretending she was just passing by even though she lived 20 minutes outside the city. Dad always told me afterward, his voice tight with discomfort, that I should keep distance where kindness wasn't enough. He never explained the full story, but I knew he carried a weariness around Celine he didn't have with anyone else. Before he died, Dad gave me a small key polished metal cold in my hand and told me it belonged to a safety deposit box. "You'll know when you need it," he said. I tucked it away, unable to face what opening that box would mean. Opening it would be acknowledging he was truly gone. The night before Milo's party, as I debated whether to go, my phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number appeared. "If you go to Celine's party tomorrow, be prepared." No explanation. No name. When I tried to call back, the number was already disconnected. I stared at the message long after the screen dimmed. A birthday party shouldn't come with warnings. And yet something told me that whatever waited at Celine's house wasn't balloons and cake. It was the beginning of a storm I never saw coming. I drove to Celine's house in Gresham with a heaviness sitting in my chest, the kind that told me nothing about this day would be simple. Her place was smaller than I remembered, older too, with paint peeling near the gutters and toys scattered across the porch, as though they had been tossed aside rather than played with. It didn't feel like a home shaped by a mother who was fully present. It felt more like somewhere you stopped, not somewhere you lived. People I didn't recognize crowded her front yard. The moment I stepped into the gate, conversations, dipped eyes cut toward me, and I felt the air shift. A woman near the grill whispered something to her friend. He muttered back, "Poor guy. He has no idea." Another voice from behind me said, "Let's see how he reacts." None of them bothered to lower their voices enough. They wanted me to hear. Or they didn't care if I did. I walked through the living room past sagging furniture and decorations meant to look festive, but somehow only made the space feel more claustrophobic. When I stepped into the backyard, Celine was standing there like she owned the sunlight itself. She had curled her hair, applied fresh makeup, and wore a dress that looked more suited for a fundraiser than a child's birthday party. She didn't look tired the way new mothers do. She looked triumphant. Her eyes found mine immediately, and for a moment the corners of her mouth lifted as if she had been waiting specifically for the expression on my face. As I moved deeper into the yard, I heard my father's name drift out from a cluster of guests near the fence. "Do you think he knows yet? About Cassian and Celine?" The words died the moment I turned my head. They dispersed like they'd been caught stealing. My grandparents sat together at a picnic table, stiff and silent. My grandmother avoided my gaze, fiddling with the hem of a napkin. My grandfather managed a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Their unease sat on them like wet wool. Celine clapped her hands for attention, lifting her plastic cup like someone about to make a grand announcement. Her posture, straightened chin, tilted eyes bright with something brazen. She held my gaze longer than necessary, placing me squarely at the center of whatever story she was about to tell. As guests huddled nearer, she scanned the crowd with an expression that was neither maternal nor radiant. It was calculating. Before she could speak, a figure appeared near the back gate. A tall man in a worn leather jacket with scruff along his jaw, and a stare that cut straight through the noise. Troy Mercer, her former boyfriend. I recognized him from a handful of strained encounters years earlier. His presence alone made the air tighten. He looked at Milo, first expression unreadable, then at me with a strange mix of resignation and warning. He stepped closer, voice low but aimed straight at me. "I should have come sooner," he muttered. "You better brace yourself." Celine's face snapped toward him, and for the first time that afternoon, her mask cracked. She wasn't expecting him. She definitely didn't want him here. And the fear that flickered through her eyes told me more than any whisper could. Despite Troy's sudden arrival and the tension splitting across her expression, Celine went ahead with whatever she had planned. She tapped her cup again, louder this time, calling for silence. Conversations died off. Even the kids paused mid-play. Celine placed a hand over her chest as though preparing to deliver a heartfelt confession, but her eyes sparkled with something else entirely. She cleared her throat, glancing dramatically around the yard. She began speaking like she was unveiling a secret she'd been forced to carry alone. She talked about grief, about timing, about truths that shouldn't die with the departed. People leaned in. My grandparents stiffened. A knot tightened in my stomach. Then she said it. "Milo is the son of Dr. Cassian Vale." The yard fell absolutely still. A couple gasped. Someone dropped a cup. My grandmother covered her mouth. And Celine kept going, her voice trembling in a way that felt rehearsed. "Which means," she announced, turning directly toward me, "Rowan must honor what Cassian intended. Milo deserves half of the house he left behind." There was a long moment where the world seemed suspended in place. I didn't feel anger or shock at first. I felt something closer to disbelief at the audacity, the performance, the way she said it, like it was an act of revelation instead of exploitation. Then unexpectedly, something inside me shifted. The absurdity hit me like a wave, and instead of breaking down, I felt laughter clawing at the back of my throat. I smiled. A small, controlled smile. "Oh," I said. "I see." Celine didn't like that reaction. Her eyes flickered, irritated that I wasn't collapsing under the weight of her claim. She lifted a printed document from the picnic table beside her, a sheet of paper in color ink with a signature that resembled my father's, if you didn't look too closely. She waved it like proof. Cassian updated his will, she insisted, to make sure his child would be taken care of. People murmured. Some stared at me with pity, others with fascination, as though wondering whether they were witnessing a family scandal or a meltdown in real time. Then Troy laughed, loudly. It cut through the silence like a blade. "That kid isn't Cassian's," he said, stepping forward. "Not even close." Celine snapped, yelling at him to leave. Her voice cracked in a way that exposed her panic. He didn't move. He just folded his arms, watching her unravel. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Because the truth was so far from her story, it bordered on ironic. My father couldn't have a child. It wasn't physically possible for reasons Celine had no way of knowing. Reasons locked away behind the key he gave me. I kept that knowledge to myself, wanting to see how far she would take her theater of lies. Then my grandmother touched my arm, pulling me away from the crowd and into the kitchen. Her hand shook. Her eyes were wet. "Rowan," she whispered, "don't make a scene. Your aunt isn't stable. Just let her have a moment." Her words hit hard, not because of what she asked, but because of what they implied. They knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to betray that this wasn't as sudden for them as it was for me. The party behind us swelled with whispers and chaos, but I felt unusually calm, almost relieved. The room smelled like frosting and stale coffee, and I realized with clarity that this was the last time Celine would ever catch me off guard. I walked out of the kitchen without another word, past the guests, past Celine, past the fake will still trembling in her hand. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply left. Because I knew something she couldn't possibly anticipate, something that lived behind the cold metal key my father pressed into my palm before he died. The answers were waiting in that safety deposit box. And tomorrow morning I would finally open it. The morning after the party, I woke feeling like the air in my house had changed. I couldn't tell if it was the weight of what Celine said, or the sharp clarity that came after realizing how far she was willing to go. Either way, I took the key my father left me, drove through the gray Portland drizzle, and walked into the downtown branch of the bank he'd done business with for decades. The vault area was quiet, cold, and mercilessly bright, the kind of sterile environment where truth couldn't hide behind emotion. The metal of the boxes clinked softly in the distance, and for a moment I had the disorienting sense that my father was somewhere in the room watching, urging me forward. The banker led me into a small private space, placed the safety deposit box on the table, and left me alone. The silence settled like a shroud. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the box and pulled the lid open. Inside, everything was arranged with my father's meticulous precision: folders labeled in his handwriting, envelopes sealed in careful lines, a bound journal, and a single letter on top with my name written across it. For Rowan, open only when necessary. I didn't open the letter yet. I couldn't. Instead, I reached for the stack of medical documents at the front. The first pages detailed his surgery for varicocele, something he had mentioned casually years ago. But the next set of documents hit harder. A successful vasectomy completed 3 years before Milo was conceived. Confirmed, verified, irreversible. There was no ambiguity, no gray area to twist into a story. My father biologically could not have fathered another child. Celine's declaration at the party wasn't just wrong, it was medically impossible. I set the papers down and reached for the journal. My father's handwriting stretched across the pages, steady at first, then growing sharper in entries that mentioned Celine. He wrote about the unease he felt when she appeared unannounced at his clinic, the way she lingered too close, the comments she made that left him uncomfortable. I remembered the tired look he wore the night she showed up unexpectedly at the office. He'd told me she made the nurses uneasy. Now I saw how deeply it had affected him. In one entry, he mentioned speaking with my mother before she died, how he told her Celine's behavior was becoming concerning, how my mother had sighed and said she had spent her entire life trying to keep Celine from crossing lines. I read slowly, absorbing the things he had shielded me from when I was younger. Then I found the documents from his attorney, Franklin Rhodes. The official will. The real one. It had the embossed seal, the notarization, the signatures of 2 witnesses, and the legal phrasing that reflected Rhodes's typical precision. Everything house assets accounts was left to me. There was no mention of any child, no provisions for Celine, no ambiguity. Finally, I opened the letter. His words felt like they were spoken directly into my chest. Rowan, if you're reading this, it means something has happened that requires you to protect yourself. I don't know what form it will take, but I know that grief makes us vulnerable, and there are people who may try to use my name to hurt you. Don't hesitate to defend what's yours. I trust you to do what I can no longer do. Remember, someone's intentions don't become pure just because they're family. At the bottom of the envelope was a small USB drive. Inside the box, I found a note explaining what it contained: emails from Celine to him, recordings from the clinic staff about her unexpected visits, even photos of her showing up at his workplace at odd hours. He had documented everything not out of paranoia, but out of a desire to protect me from the fallout he felt was inevitable. When I closed the box, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Grief for what my father endured, gratitude that he had prepared so thoroughly, and a rising sense of resolve. Celine hadn't stumbled into a misunderstanding. She had built a plan brick by brick on the assumption that I wouldn't know how to fight back. But she was wrong. The truth was finally in my hands, and whatever happened next, I would not be walking into it blind. I drove straight from the bank to Franklin Rhodes' office in downtown Portland. His firm sat inside an old brick building with oak-paneled walls and heavy wooden doors, an atmosphere that felt grounded, controlled, and completely different from the chaos unfolding in my family. Rhodes was in his 60s, sharp-eyed but warm, the kind of attorney my father trusted because he didn't deal in uncertainty. He greeted me gently, offering condolences that felt genuine instead of obligatory. I handed him the document Celine flaunted at the party. The moment he unfolded it, he exhaled sharply. "This is sloppy," he said. "Incorrect legal phrasing, formatting that doesn't meet state requirements, and the signature, your father's handwriting, was decisive. This is an imitation, and not a competent one." He tapped the page, then looked at me over his glasses. If she attempted to use this to claim property, it's a criminal act. Forgery and attempted fraud at this scale come with real consequences. Hearing it spoken aloud gave weight to what I'd already known. I told him everything what Celine claimed the scene at the party, Troy's sudden appearance. Rhodes listened intently, occasionally jotting notes, then leaned back. You need more than just the truth. You need context. People resort to this kind of tactic when they're under pressure. You should consider hiring an investigator. He recommended Ezra Collings, a former police detective who now worked independently. Ezra arrived at the firm that afternoon, a quiet man with observant eyes, a straightforward manner, and a handshake that told me he didn't waste time. I gave him the summary without embellishment. He nodded, once said he'd begin immediately, and walked out with the kind of efficiency that made me trust him on instinct. 3 days later, he returned with a manila folder and a grim expression. He laid out the report piece by piece. Celine was drowning financially, over $70,000 in debt from credit cards, payday loans, overdue medical bills for Milo, and 3 months of unpaid rent. She was one notice away from eviction. Her income was inconsistent, and she'd been cut off from several lenders due to repeated defaults. Then came the part that made my stomach knot. Troy Mercer, the man who showed up at the party, was indeed Milo's biological father. Ezra confirmed it through medical billing records, social worker notes, and an old paternity test filed during a custody dispute. Troy had left the state after facing allegations of domestic violence and unpaid child support in Washington. He had no involvement in Milo's life, offered no financial help, and left Celine alone with the fallout. Finally, Ezra set a stack of printed messages on the table. They were between Celine and a friend. If this will holds up, I'll finally get my break. Rowan doesn't deserve everything. I need that house more than he does. I'm not losing Milo and my home. This is the only chance I have. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't desperation. It was strategy, cold, calculated, and aimed straight at me. I sat back, absorbing all of it. Celine wasn't drowning. She was clawing for air and grabbing whatever she could pull down with her. But she had crossed a line the moment she used my father's name to justify her selfishness. Ezra closed the folder and met my eye. You have enough to pursue legal action if that's what you choose. I nodded slowly. The pieces were shifting into place. The truth was now broader, deeper, darker than I had expected. Celine's actions were no longer just offensive, they were dangerous. And whether I wanted the fight or not, it was already coming straight at me. I called Celine the morning after I met with Rhodes and Ezra. My voice was steady in a way it hadn't been in weeks. I told her to come to the house in Hawthorne District, that we needed to talk privately before anything went further. She arrived right on time, dressed as if she expected a negotiation rather than a reckoning. Her posture was confident, almost smug, as she stepped into the living room. She didn't sit until I motioned to the chair across from me. When she did, she placed a folder, the forged will, directly between us, like she believed it still had power over me. Before she could say anything, I set my phone on the table, turned on the voice recorder, and said clearly, "For transparency, I'd like to record this conversation, so both sides have a record." She stiffened, but after a moment she nodded, pretending to be unfazed. She even gave a soft laugh. "Rowan, we're family. There's no need for dramatics." She started talking first, spinning a story she had clearly practiced. She described her supposed affair with my father in vivid detail, down to the hotel room, the nights he supposedly confessed his unhappiness. The moments she claimed were intimate. She even wiped a fake tear and shook her head dramatically, as if overwhelmed by emotion. But I knew the exact dates she was mentioning. 3 of them were nights when my father was on rotation at the hospital, documented in his schedule and in the medical records sitting upstairs in my desk. I waited until she finished, then leaned forward. "All right," I said. "Let me ask you something simple. Which hand did my father write with?" She blinked confused and answered, "Left." "He was right-handed," I said quietly. I gave her no chance to recover before I asked another question. Was he allergic to shellfish or not? She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Remember the dinner when he wasn't allergic to anything?" I said. Her breathing became uneven. Sweat formed along her hairline, but she still tried to push through the lies. I asked about small daily habits, his favorite drink, whether he ever drank alcohol, which side of the bed he slept on. Every single answer she gave was wrong, and with each mistake, her confidence cracked a little more. I reached for the first document. The real will, notarized and stamped, written long before Milo was even a thought. I laid it in the center of the table. The moment she saw it, her face drained of color. "This is the legal will," I said. "The one filed with the state. The one witnessed by 2 attorneys. Everything goes to me. Nothing goes to anyone else." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I placed the second set of documents beside the first. My father's medical records. "These were completed 3 years before Milo was born," I said. "The surgery, the vasectomy, the follow-up confirming it was successful. My father could not have had another child." She stared at the papers as if they were burning her hands, though she hadn't touched them. Then I plugged the USB into my laptop and turned the screen toward her. Emails she had sent my father, late-night messages that crossed lines, notes from clinic staff reporting how uncomfortable she made them. My father documenting every instance in quiet detail so I wouldn't face this blind after he was gone. When the first recording played, the one of her telling a friend she could get half my house if Milo carried the veil name, she finally broke. Tears streamed down her face, but not the manipulative kind from earlier. These were real, panicked, ugly tears born from the realization that the entire foundation of her plan was crumbling. She confessed everything in fragments about the debts, the overdue rent, the medical bills, how Troy had vanished and left her with nothing. She said she was scared, hopeless, drowning. But even as she cried, she insisted she hadn't done anything wrong by lying about my father. That was when something inside me shifted. I looked at her and saw not just someone desperate, but someone who had chosen deception over honesty, manipulation over apology. I realized this wasn't just a messy family conflict. What she had done was criminal. She asked me what I planned to do, whether I would report her, whether I wanted Milo taken from her, whether I hated her. I didn't answer immediately. I sat with the choice, the anger, the grief, the knowledge that my father had predicted this exact moment. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. "I haven't decided," I said. "But whatever I choose, it won't be in this room. It'll be in front of everyone." Her face went pale again. She covered her mouth with her hands. "You wouldn't." "I will," I said, "because this doesn't get fixed in the dark." Her breath shook as she whispered, "Please, Rowan. Please." I stood up. "Tomorrow evening, the whole family. Here." As she walked out, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. And for the first time since my father's funeral, I felt something like clarity. The truth was no longer hidden, and it was my responsibility to put it in the open. I spent the entire next day preparing the house, not because I wanted the family gathering to feel welcoming, but because I needed the setting to be controlled. When my grandparents arrived first, they looked nervous, almost guilty. My grandmother carried a tray of food she didn't seem to remember holding. My grandfather avoided my eyes. They didn't ask about Celine, and I didn't offer anything. Celine arrived last. Her makeup was streaked, her eyes swollen, her posture wounded, but still trying to hide the panic roiling beneath the surface. She kept her gaze on the carpet as she walked inside, as if looking at me might shatter her entirely. When everyone had settled in the living room, I stood. My voice carried more evenly than I expected. "You all deserve to hear what Selene said at Milo's birthday," I began, word for word. I repeated everything: how she announced Milo was my father's child, how she claimed the house was legally hers, how she waved a forged will in front of a yard full of people. My grandmother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. My grandfather muttered something under his breath and shook his head. Celine shut her eyes tight, as though she could retreat into darkness and escape the truth gathering around her. I placed the real will on the coffee table open so they could all see the notarization, the date, the signatures. "This is the real document," I said. "Prepared years ago. Nothing was changed. Everything was left to me." No one spoke. Then I placed the medical records beside it. "And this," I continued, "is proof my father could not have biologically fathered another child. His surgery was years before Milo was conceived." My grandparents stared as if each sentence peeled back a layer of denial they'd held on to tightly. My grandmother began to cry big broken tears that fell into her lap. Then I explained what my father had written in his journal, the visits she made to his clinic without warning, the messages she sent him at night, the discomfort she caused everyone around her. I spoke not with anger, but with the steady weight of truth. Finally, I played the audio recording of Celine telling her friend she needed half the house and that all she had to do was make Milo avail. The room felt colder after the recording stopped. The air was thick with disbelief and shame. Celine collapsed to her knees, sobbing openly. Not controlled tears, not performative grief. She confessed everything between gasps, her debts, her fear of losing Milo. Her desperation, the eviction notice, the way Troy had abandoned her. She said she felt trapped and saw my house as her only escape. My grandmother stood abruptly and said she only wanted to provide for her child. I met her gaze without flinching. She wanted to save herself. Milo was a shield, nothing more. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, necessary. I told them plainly that Celine's actions were criminal, that I had enough evidence to pursue charges that could take her to court, even take Milo away if the state viewed her actions as harmful. Celine crawled closer, begging me not to do it. "Milo needs me," she cried. "Please." I looked at her and felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness but understanding. There was a difference between letting someone escape consequences and choosing a path that didn't destroy a child innocent in all of this. So I laid out my terms. She would confess everything to the family. She would enter therapy. She would attend financial counseling. She would maintain steady employment. I would create a trust fund for Milo, but she would never touch the money. She would never again attempt to manipulate anything tied to the Vale name. If she violated any part of the agreement, I would take action immediately. No one moved when I finished. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath. In that moment, facing all of them, I realized something new. I wasn't standing in my father's place. I was standing in my own. And I finally understood the burden he carried, the weight of protecting a family fractured long before I ever saw the cracks. What happened next would no longer be defined by lies or fear. It would be defined by truth, and by the choice I made to live by it. In the quiet that followed after everyone had gone home and the last words of that family meeting finally settled into the walls of my father's house, I stood alone in the living room and let myself breathe. Not the shallow, guarded breaths I'd been taking for weeks, but a real one deep enough to shake something loose inside me. For the first time since the funeral, the house didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like mine. It felt like his. And maybe for the first time, it felt like a place where I could begin again. I kept thinking about what my father wrote in his letter, that people would try to use his name, that truth wouldn't always protect itself. I used to think he meant strangers or the world outside our home. I didn't expect he meant people who shared our blood. But standing there in the silence he left behind, I realized he wasn't teaching me to fight. He was teaching me to stand, to stay rooted, to choose integrity even when you're tired, even when you're hurt, even when doing the right thing feels heavier than letting everything fall apart. And maybe that's the part of this story that stays with me the most. Not the lies, or the betrayal, or the fight over a house. It's the understanding that healing doesn't look like a clean victory. It looks like setting boundaries. It looks like choosing truth when it would be easier to walk away. It looks like saying enough even when your voice shakes. That's what I did tonight. And even though my family may never look the same again, I know I honored my father in the only way that mattered, by living the kind of honesty he lived every day. I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you're going through something heavy, family conflict, loss, or a truth that feels too big to carry, you're not alone. Stories like mine don't get tied up neatly. They just keep going, one honest step at a time. Before I close this chapter, I'd love to know you're here with me. Comment listening, or tell me where you're watching from. It helps more than you think, just knowing someone out there heard this story all the way through. And if my father's message or my journey meant something to you today, I hope you'll subscribe. It's one simple way to stay connected as I share more stories that dig into the quiet, complicated corners of family grief and rebuilding. Thank you for staying with me until the end. This was not an easy story to tell, but I'm grateful you were here to hear it.